Okay, I want to go into taxonomy, which is just a fancy term for scientific names today. Going back to the beginning, which gives you a little bit of a basis on why things are the way they are. Back in the day, most of your universities they started as church institutions. Theology was the big thing that people went to school for, and other things kind of branched off of that. And at one time, the church was really pro-science, and it's a whole other thing with the love-hate relationship between the Catholic Church and religion in general and science. But, things started out being taught in Latin. Basically, everybody who went to higher education, they learned Latin and usually Greek as well. And people in Europe could go from one country to another to study at a university, and they knew Latin. All the courses would be taught in Latin. That is why all your medical, chemical, botanical, etc. names are all in Latin. That's why everything's in Greek and Latin, because everybody who went to college up until probably the mid-1800s at least was fluent in Latin and most likely Greek as well. That was the lingua franca. Yeah, lingua franca. If you knew Latin, you could speak to anybody who was educated within the European continent and even the European colonies. You'll also notice that a lot of the historical figures have Latinized names. They would publish their works in Latin so that everybody could read them, and they would Latinize their names. Excuse me. That goes for even Christopher Columbus. Cristobal Colon in Spanish is his name. Columbus is Latinized from his actual everyday name. Nostradamus. Michel de Nostradam is his real name in French. Latinized name. That they published their works in Latin. And that brings us to the subject of the day, the guy who invented the binomial taxonomy that we are still using to this present day, slightly modified, but the inventor was a guy named Carl von Linnaeus from Sweden. His name is Carolus Linnaeus in Latin. That's what we know him by. His disciples went out and classified the world, basically. He mainly focused on botany, but he also dabbled in other things. That's why zoology, mycology, all these other branches that name plants, animals, fungus, etc., they're all based on the same system. They've even tried doing taxonomy with soil and rocks, but it's kind of split off into its own separate thing a little bit more. His disciples, like Kalm, I believe, came to the United States, and Thunberg went to Europe, and there's a lot of things that are Thunbergii for plants in Asia especially, and also invasive ones that came over here. But the basic system, you've got your kingdoms and phyla and everything else, but the part that you need to worry about in everyday terms without going into the whole tree of life here is genus and species. Every species has a binomial name. The first name is the genus. It is always capitalized. The second name is the species. It is never capitalized. Even if it refers to a country or a proper name, it is always all lowercase. After it is first mentioned, if it is mentioned again later in the same writing, often the genus is abbreviated. And sometimes, if it's kind of generally known, it is also abbreviated. An example of that is E. coli. E is E period coli, meaning basically from the colon, or the digestive system, is Escherichia coli is the full name of that bacteria. Just they abbreviate that E period all the time. An example would be white pine, Pinus strobus. Pinus is the genus, always capitalized. Strobus, specific name, never capitalized. A combination of these two names tells you exactly what you're looking at. There can be several members within a genus, but each specific name only pertains to one species. This is your standard throughout everything. Above and beyond that, sometimes things are farther broken down with a third name for a subspecies or a variation. Sometimes scientists vary on exactly who calls what, but subspecies would be a third name. Common juniper, Juniperus communis is the species. The main version of that would be listed, if you took it out to that third name, as Juniperus communis. The type that is found through most of the United States, the one that's found in Pennsylvania at least, is Juniperus communis depressa. I believe it's depressa at any rate. I may be mistaken on that, but yeah, don't be afraid to get into the mix and butcher these things. That's the only way you learn. But at any rate, that's that. And then sometimes there's certain variations that may not really be considered a subspecies. I've noticed that with flowering dog food, Cornus florida. Cornus florida Rubens, I believe it is, or is just the red flowered variant. Every now and then you find a tree that will have pink or red bracts. They're actually not the flowers; they're bracts. But that's another story. But just the ones that are red are considered a different variety. They're not really considered distinct enough by most people to be a separate subspecies. Usually, if it's just a variety, that third name will have a little VAR period in front of that third name. A lot of times in the horticultural trade, they use common names and just have little quotation marks around whatever hybrid or variety it is. Hybrids are normally shown with an X between the two specific names within the genus that are hybridized. Hybrids are almost entirely within a single genus. Usually beyond that, they're just too far apart to hybridize. So say theoretically you could hybridize a white pine with a red pine. It would be Pinus strobus X resinosa. And, that's the way they would do it. Sometimes if what it's hybridized with, or sometimes if it's a horticultural variety and it's kind of a trade secret or something, you'll just see the genus with X, whatever the hell they're calling that variety. So say they, trying to think off the top of my head of an example, but just say they crossed a red pine and a white pine and called it a pink pine. You might see Pinus X pink. That just means it's a hybrid. I think that's about it for that. It's always good to learn the scientific names. They tend to be much more stable than common names. Common names can vary from region to region and even from person to person within a region. Wintergreen is a good example. It can mean anything that's green in your area. A lot of times Gaultheria procumbens is listed as wintergreen when you look it up by its common name in a book or on the internet. I learned it as teaberry up in New England. They call it checkerberry. people can sometimes be talking about the same thing or different things with the same common name, or they can be talking about the same thing with two different common names. It's all over the map. There's things like knotweed. I think there's half a dozen things in Pennsylvania that the common name is just knotweed, although there are several different species that common name would apply to. So you got to be careful there. A lot of times there's odd colloquial names too. There's impatiens. I've heard some people call them waterweed, just because they're real wet when you break into them. People don't know a name for something; they just make one up, and that might stick within a certain group of friends that grew up in a neighborhood somewhere or whatever. Around here in Pittsburgh, we call just about anything thorny a jaggerbush, and specifically, we normally call the native blackberries Rubus alleghaniensis. We normally call that and other blackberries jaggerbushes. That's a jaggerbush. A rosebush we might distinguish separately, but that's a jaggerbush. Anywhere outside of this area, you say jaggerbush, nobody has a clue what the hell you're talking about. Recently, it's gotten a little bit more complicated. There's always been a little bit of PhD students researching things and arguing over the history of things being named. Normally the first person to scientifically name something, everybody follows that convention, and some people dispute the records and argue about things, and sometimes you'll see where it says there's a synonym of another name, maybe it was previously used and no longer recognized. Sometimes different groups recognize different names. It's not that bad. Some plant kingdoms are a little bit worse than others because they're more confusing. DNA testing has complicated things because now we're finding out that things that were grouped together by the way they look may not be as closely related as we thought. There's a thing called convergent evolution where two things that aren't related kind of adapt the same way to the same environment and may look superficially the same. And some genuses were just, or sometimes they I guess technically the proper plural is genera. They're more problematic than others. They were just used as like a wastebasket for everything that kind of looked alike, and a lot of these are being untangled with DNA testing, and they're creating new genuses, and it makes it complicated, but it's still good to know the scientific name. And since the Catholic Church stopped having Latin masses in the 60s, it's really kind of gone by the wayside on any consistent pronunciation of Latin. Generally, Latin for our purposes falls into the category of ecclesiastical Latin, church Latin, that was spoken from the Middle Ages onwards, rather than classical Latin, which is slightly different. But ecclesiastical Latin is generally pronounced similar to Italian or Spanish. Americans tend to Americanize things. Individuals pronounce things differently. It's not that big of a deal. As long as you're close enough that people kind of can figure out what the hell you're talking about, it's not that big of a deal. Don't be afraid to get into the fray. You'll notice I botch a lot of the pronunciations. Don't care. I mean, I try to get better, but it's not that big of a deal. It's not something to be self-conscious about and let it stop you from learning and getting out there and getting into the mix. So that's it for this video. See you on the next one.